For decades, driving a car was one of the most physically demanding things a person could do in ordinary daily life. Not racing, not off-roading, just driving to work. And almost
nobody's complaining
about it. Before the 1950s, most cars on American roads had no power steering, no power brakes, and interiors that offered next to nothing in terms of comfort or support. You sat on a flat bench seat, gripped a wheel the size of a serving platter, and muscled that car through every turn, every parking lot, every crowded street. Your arms did the work. Your legs pushed those brake pedals with real force. And if you were parallel parking something like a 1948 Buick Roadmaster, a car that weighed close to 2 tons, you'd better have had strong forearms, because the car was not going to help you. Here's what makes this remarkable. At the peak of the manual effort era, American car sales hit record numbers. Buyers were lined up. Demand was booming, and the cars that required genuine physical labor to operate were flying off the lots. That's not a coincidence. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. Hey, this is Mark, and you're welcome to Auto Says. If that already surprised you, stay with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where this goes. But first, I need you to hold on to a question, because there's something that happened in 1951, a quiet decision made inside a Chrysler engineering lab that would eventually change not just how cars felt to drive, but what Americans expected from machines in general. We'll get back to that, but to understand why it mattered, you have to understand what came before it. Go back to the 1930s and 1940s. Cars in that era were enormous. Long, heavy, built from thick steel, with front axles and steering geometry designed more for stability at speed than for ease of movement. The steering systems of the time were pure mechanical linkages. Your input at the wheel went directly to the front wheels, with no amplification, no assistance, no buffer. What you put in, the car returned. Nothing more. And the wheels themselves were wide, low-profile tires with a lot of contact with the road surface. That sounds like it would make steering easier. It didn't. More contact means more friction. More friction means more resistance. Turning a stationary or slow-moving car with those tires felt like trying to redirect something that genuinely did not want to move. Experienced drivers learned to anticipate turns far in advance, to keep the car rolling slightly while steering, to use momentum to lighten the load. You didn't steer those cars so much as you negotiated with them. The brakes were no different. Most cars through the 1940s ran on drum brakes with mechanical or early hydraulic actuation, and stopping distances that would be terrifying by today's standards. Panic stops required standing on that pedal with everything you had. Drivers kept both hands on the wheel, not because it was a safety rule, but because they genuinely needed both hands to stay in control. Driving was a physical act. You felt it in your shoulders the next day. Now here's where the story gets interesting. The auto industry was well aware of how physically demanding their cars were. Engineers weren't blind, and there was already a solution on the table. Power-assisted steering had been theorized and prototyped as far back as the 1920s. The concept wasn't mysterious. You use hydraulic pressure or an electric motor to supplement the driver's input, reducing the effort required to turn the wheel. Simple in principle. But for years, nobody put it in a production car. The reasons are worth understanding because they reveal something about how the industry thought about its customers. First, there was cost. Adding a hydraulic power steering system to a production car in the 1940s was expensive, and American automakers in that era were already navigating massive post-war retooling costs. Every dollar spent on engineering was a dollar taken from margin. Second, and this is the part the history books usually skip, there was a genuine internal debate about whether drivers even wanted the help. This is not a joke. Inside certain corners of the industry, there was a belief that driving difficulty was not a flaw to be corrected, but a feature to be preserved. A heavy, responsive car that demanded skill to operate communicated something to the driver, and to people watching the driver. It said, "This machine respects you enough to demand something from you." Some engineers genuinely believed that making driving too easy would devalue the experience. Strip away the effort, and what do you have? Not driving, something else. That debate came to a head in 1951. Chrysler introduced power steering as an option on the Chrysler Imperial, a large luxury sedan aimed at wealthy buyers. The system was called Hydraguide. It worked. It worked remarkably well. Parking that Imperial suddenly felt like moving a much smaller, lighter car. Turns that used to require planning and muscle became effortless. Drivers who tried it didn't want to go back. And yet, it wasn't an immediate revolution. Here's what the sales numbers tell you. Power steering spread slowly through the industry through the early 1950s. It appeared first on luxury models, then on mid-range options, and only later on more affordable cars. That rollout pattern wasn't accidental. The automakers priced it as a premium feature, which had two effects. It funded the technology's development, and it told buyers that physical effort was a class issue. If you had money, you didn't have to work as hard to drive. If you couldn't afford the option, you kept wrestling the wheel. By 1956, power steering was available on most new American cars as either standard or optional equipment. By the early 1960s, it was expected. And here is the number that tells you everything about how fast the market moved once it started. In 1950, less than 1% of American cars on the road had power steering. By 1965, more than 60% did. That shift happened in 15 years. That's not evolution. That's a market deciding, collectively and almost overnight, that it had been tolerating something it never actually had to tolerate. Which raises a bigger question that nobody was asking out loud at the time. If power steering was technically possible in the 1920s, if the engineering wasn't the barrier, then who benefited from making drivers work harder for all those decades? And was the physical effort of driving actually protecting something, or just something the industry had never gotten around to removing? The answer is more complicated than it looks, because when you pull back and look at what happened to car culture after power steering became universal, you start to see trade-offs that nobody fully anticipated. Driving became genuinely easier. Accessible to older drivers, smaller drivers, people who hadn't grown up behind a wheel. That broadened the market, and it showed in sales figures. More people bought cars when the cars became easier to use. The total US auto market in 1955 was around 7 million units. By 1965, it was approaching 9 million. Power steering alone didn't drive that growth. But the broader shift toward driver assist features, power steering, automatic transmissions, power brakes, together, they converted driving from a skill with a learning curve into something almost anyone could do with a few hours of practice. And that democratization had a financial consequence the industry had not fully modeled. When driving stopped being hard, the psychological attachment between driver and car changed. For the generation that had learned on those heavy manual machines, driving a car felt like an accomplishment. It felt like something you'd earned. The car responded to your effort, or resisted it, and either way, the relationship was physical and personal. You remembered cars you'd driven because you'd worked to drive them. When that effort disappeared, something in the buyer relationship shifted. Cars became more comfortable, more effortless, more pleasant, and slightly less memorable. The industry compensated by doubling down on luxury, on size, on power outputs, on status signaling through chrome and styling. But the visceral bond between body and machine was changing, and it changed faster than anyone in Detroit was tracking. Here's what most people never think about when they look back at old cars. The drivers who operated those machines weren't struggling despite the design. They were adapting to it, and in adapting, they developed a relationship with their cars that was fundamentally different from what came after. They knew exactly how their car would respond on a cold morning. They could feel the road surface through the wheel. They knew by feel when the front end was about to push wide on a turn. That feedback loop, uncomfortable as it was, created drivers who understood their cars at a level that became increasingly rare once power assist filtered everything out. The irony is that today, decades later, automotive engineers are spending significant money and research effort trying to put some of that feedback back in. It's called steering feel. Performance car buyers pay a premium for direct ratio steering racks that transmit more road information to their hands. Manufacturers advertise the communicativeness of their steering as a selling point. What was once the default, the thing everyone wanted to get rid of, is now a luxury feature on sports cars. The circle completed itself. It just took 60 years. There's a version of automotive history that reads as pure progress. Every decade bringing more comfort, more ease, more technology. But the story of power steering doesn't quite fit that frame. It's a story about what we gain when we remove effort from an experience, and what quietly disappears along with it. And the answer isn't comfortable, because it suggests that some of what we call improvement is actually substitution. Think about the last time you drove a car that felt genuinely connected to the road. Not a machine that insulated you from the experience, but one that put you inside it. For a lot of people, that's a borrowed car, or a rental, or something they drove decades ago. If you've ever felt that a modern car drives itself almost too well, that there's something missing despite the technology, you are feeling the residue of this story. So here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. If you've driven both, a car with manual steering effort and one with full power assist, which one did you actually prefer to drive? Not which one was more practical. Which one felt more like driving? And if you want to understand the next piece of this story, what happened when the auto industry applied the same logic to braking, to shifting, to everything else drivers used to do by hand, that video is coming next. The short version is, the trade-off got bigger, and not everyone was happy about it, and was